Hello there, my sleepy fellows. Tonight, let us wander together into the heart of Middle-earth, where old legends whisper upon the wind, and the fires of forgotten battles still smolder in the depths of time. Let us step softly through the pages of history, where the rise of Rohan and the fall of Isengard became turning points in an age of darkness. This is a tale of wisdom and war, of Gandalf's unseen hand guiding the fate of kings and the fall of a once mighty tower. But let the journey begin not with battle, but with quiet footsteps upon soft earth. The winds of Middle-earth whisper of many tales, my sleepy fellows, stories of valor and wisdom, of ruin and renewal, and tonight we turn our gaze to a time of great change, when the power of Isengard crumbled and the Riders of Rohan rose to reclaim their strength. But before we journey forth, I invite you to settle in, breathe deeply, and let the world around you fade away. Here, there is no rush, no urgency, only the steady rhythm of words carrying you gently into the heart of Middle-earth. If you find comfort in these tales, in the soft unraveling of ancient stories, consider joining us on more such journeys, where legends unfold like leaves in autumn, and the past lingers in the hush of the wind. And if you wish to travel with us again, let the stars guide your way by subscribing and gently tapping the bell icon so that these stories may find you when the night calls for rest. At the heart of this story stands Gandalf, ever watchful, ever guiding. Long before the White Wizard rode to the gates of Helm's Deep, he saw the shadows creeping over Rohan, felt the poison taking root in King Théoden's heart, and knew that the hand of Saruman was at work. Isengard, once a place of wisdom, had become a fortress of iron and industry, its waters defiled, its forges burning with dark intent. Saruman the White had turned from the light, his voice weaving lies as skillfully as his hands built armies. But even in the heart of darkness, there are those who listen still to the whisper of hope. Rohan, the land of proud riders, stood at a precipice, its people lost, its king ensnared by whispers not his own. But as the tides of war loomed, so too did the quiet, unseen hand of Gandalf, weaving fate where others saw only despair. This is the story of the fall of Isengard, of the rise of Rohan, and of the choices that shaped an age. Let the tale unfold now, softly, like the turning of a great and ancient page. The world had begun to change long before swords were drawn, before banners of war were raised, before the hammering of industry drowned out the soft songs of the earth. It began in whispers, in shadows cast by a mind once noble but now bent by its own desire for power. It began in Isengard, beneath the high tower of Orthanc, where Saruman the White once stood as a guardian of wisdom, but had long since forsaken the light. And yet, this tale does not begin in Isengard, nor in the fires of war. Instead, we turn first to a land where the wind runs wild and free, where golden fields stretch beneath endless skies, where the Rohirrim once rode without fear, their songs carried upon the air like birds in flight. This is Rohan, the land of the horse lords. At its heart stood Meduseld, the golden hall of King Théoden, where the flickering torches once cast warmth upon the faces of loyal men, and the laughter of warriors filled the rafters. But now, those same halls stood quiet and cold. The king sat weary upon his throne, his eyes clouded, his voice distant, as if his very spirit had begun to fade. By his side stood Grima Wormtongue, his voice ever soft, ever insidious. His words dripped like honey, yet they carried the weight of chains, binding the king in an invisible prison of doubt and despair. It was not through blades that Saruman sought to break Rohan, but through whispered lies, through a slow decay of will, until even the mightiest of men bent beneath the weight of unseen shackles. And so, the warriors of Rohan stood uncertain. Their borders were threatened, their allies silent, their king lost within a web spun by Saruman's cunning voice. Yet beyond Rohan's golden plains, beyond the iron gates of Isengard, another force moved unseen, Gandalf the Grey, ever watchful, ever knowing. He had seen the rot taking root, had felt the weight of darkness creeping into the bones of the world. He had walked the hidden paths, gathering knowledge, seeking the strands of fate that had yet to be woven. Gandalf knew that war would come, that the storm upon the horizon could not be held back. But he also knew that even in the darkest hour, there remained a spark, a king who had not yet fallen completely, a people who could still rise, a land that could still be saved. And so, he set his course for Rohan, carrying with him the winds of change. The golden fields of Rohan stretched far and wide beneath the rolling sky, their tall grasses swaying gently as the wind ran freely across the land. For centuries, this was a place of strength, where the Rohirrim rode like the wind, their songs filling the air, their laughter carried upon the breeze. But now, an unease had settled upon the land, unseen yet heavy, like the hush before a going storm. In Meduseld, the great golden hall atop the hill of Edoras, the fire burned low in the hearth. Once, these flames had warmed the hearts of warriors and kings alike, but now the shadows flickered higher than the light. King Théoden sat upon his throne, his once sharp gaze distant, his once strong hands weak upon the armrests. The golden crown upon his head seemed heavier than it had ever been. He had ruled for many years, but of late a strange weariness had settled upon him, as if the very breath of life was slowly being drained from his bones. He listened, though barely, to the murmur of voices in his hall, words that once stirred his heart, now sounding like whispers on a distant wind. And always at his side, Grima Wormtongue, his voice low and silken, his presence an unseen chain that wrapped itself tighter around the king's will with each passing day. Théoden no longer rode out upon the plains. His sword lay untouched, gathering dust. His warriors spoke in hushed tones beyond the doors of the hall, glancing warily toward the king they loved but no longer recognized. And beyond Meduseld, Rohan itself began to wither, as if the land knew its ruler had fallen into shadow. Across the Riddermark, the people of Rohan continued their daily lives, yet something felt different. The markets in Edoras were quieter, The great feasts and songs that once filled the town had faded. The fields stretched golden under the sun, yet there was a stillness that did not belong, as though the land itself held its breath. The riders still patrolled the borders, though fewer in number now. Orcs had been seen in the Eastfold, and wolves were venturing closer to the villages. The people whispered of dark things moving in the shadows, though none dared speak too loudly, for fear that to name the evil would give it power. The wind carried news of trouble from the west. The fords of Isen had seen battle, and though no great war had yet come, the watchmen upon the hills saw the distant smoke of burning villages in the far distance. Yet, even as the signs of danger grew, the king remained silent. He did not call upon his riders. He did not ride to war. Something held him still, like a lion bound in unseen chains. It was not only the warriors who noticed the change in the air. The wise women of Rohan, those who knew the old songs and listened to the wind, began to feel the presence of something unnatural. Some said they could hear a strange whisper in the wind, like the faintest echo of a voice too soft to understand. Others spoke of dreams filled with shadows, where Meduseld lay dark and abandoned, its golden roof tarnished and crumbling. In the valleys where the shepherds led their flocks, there were reports of strange lights at night, flickering upon the far edges of the land. Was it fire? Was it magic? No one could say. Even the horses, the pride of Rohan, seemed restless. The great steeds of the mark, usually swift and fearless, now snorted at shadows, their ears flicking as if hearing something beyond mortal ears. And beneath the golden roof of Meduseld, Théoden dreamed, but whether they were dreams of memory or visions of things to come, no one knew. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the distant mountains, the watchman upon the walls of Edoras saw a lone rider upon the horizon. He was cloaked in gray, his wide-brimmed hat casting his face into shadow, yet the light of the setting sun seemed to bend around him, illuminating the white beard that fell past his shoulders. The watchmen stiffened, gripping their spears, for though they had not yet seen his face, they knew who it was. Gandalf, the gray pilgrim, the one who had come before, who had warned of darkness long ago. He rode at a steady pace toward Edoras, as if he had all the time in the world, but his heart was heavy, for he knew that the battle for Rohan's fate had already begun, not with swords, but with whispers, not with war, but with slow, creeping decay. And he had come to break the spell before it was too late. Rohan stood upon the edge of a blade, its king trapped in a web of deceit, its people blind to the storm gathering beyond their borders. But Gandalf had seen these threads long before. He knew what lay ahead: the fall of Isengard, the rise of Rohan, and the turning of the tide in the great war to come. As his horse, Shadowfax, carried him toward the Golden Hall, he whispered a single name under his breath, a name that would be restored to the world before long: Théoden. The time had come to awaken the king. The golden evening light cast long shadows across the plains of Rohan, painting the world in hues of amber and crimson. The wind, which had once carried the joyful songs of the Rohirrim, now moved with a hush, as if whispering secrets only the land could hear. Atop his steed, Shadowfax, Gandalf the Grey rode ever closer to Edoras, his sharp eyes fixed upon the golden hall of Meduseld in the distance. Though the city of the Horse Lords stood strong upon the hill, there was something unseen festering beneath its beauty, a sickness, an enchantment, a will not entirely its own. Gandalf had seen such things before. He knew the nature of dark whispers, of the magic woven through words rather than steel. Saruman had once been a friend, a trusted leader among the wise, but that time had passed. The White Wizard had chosen his path, and now Rohan lay ensnared in his deceit. As Gandalf rode, the land itself seemed to respond to his presence. The horses of Rohan, creatures of great spirit and wisdom, lifted their heads, their ears flicking forward, as if hearing something only they could perceive. The sky above stretched vast and empty, but something unseen was shifting, like the faintest ripple upon still water. The wizard sighed, deep and knowing. Time was against them. Meanwhile, beyond the city walls, upon the westernmost ridges of Rohan's rolling hills, the people of the land had begun to sense something strange. Shepherds watching over their flocks near the White Mountains had reported odd occurrences, nothing grand or terrible, only whispers of things out of place. They spoke of strange lights flickering in the high valleys, seen at dusk, but never in full darkness. Others whispered of winds that spoke, though when they turned their heads, there was no one there. A few among the oldest of the herdsmen had felt something deeper, a stirring in the earth, as though Rohan itself was beginning to awaken. "The land knows," one of them murmured, sitting beside his fire, staring toward Meduseld's distant glow. "The land remembers." Within Meduseld, beneath its gilded roof, Grima Wormtongue sat in shadow, his dark eyes ever watchful. He knew Gandalf was coming. Saruman's whispers had carried on the wind, warning him of the Grey Pilgrim's return. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the torches flickered as if disturbed by an unseen force. Change was coming, but he had done his work well. King Théoden sat quiet and unmoving, his shoulders heavy, his once great voice reduced to weary murmurs. The king of the Horse Lords had been reduced to a shadow of himself, and Wormtongue had made sure that no one, not his niece, Éowyn, nor his nephew, Éomer, nor even the warriors who still whispered in the halls, could break Saruman's hold. At least, not yet. That same night, as the moon rose high over Edoras, a solitary figure stood at the edge of the city's walls, wrapped in a cloak that billowed in the wind. Éowyn, the White Lady of Rohan, the king's niece, the Shield Maiden, whose spirit had not yet been broken, though sorrow and worry had weighed upon her for many long months. She stood alone, staring down the great road that led toward the city gates. She had sensed something in the air that evening, something stirring beyond the horizon. And then, a flicker of silver in the distance, a rider, her breath caught, Gandalf. She knew the shape of his form, the way he rode as though the very wind carried him. She did not move, not yet, but her heart began to race. For the first time in many months, hope stirred within her. Elsewhere, beyond the gates of Isengard, Saruman stood upon the balcony of Orthanc, staring into the distance. He, too, could sense Gandalf's coming. His once white robes had grown stained with shadow, his once clear voice now laced with the very deception he had once fought against. "The old fool rides to his doom," Saruman murmured, his voice a whisper that carried upon the wind. "Let him come." The night stretched silent and still, save for the distant creak of the forges below, where orcs and twisted men worked the great machines of war, their hands shaping steel for battle. War was coming. Saruman's fingers curled around his staff, and soon all of Rohan would burn. As Gandalf neared Edoras, the land seemed to pulse with anticipation. The torches lining the city's gates flickered as though in welcome, though the guards standing watch did not yet know what the dawn would bring. Gandalf could feel it in his bones, the threads of fate beginning to shift. Tomorrow he would stand before Théoden. Tomorrow he would speak words that must be heard. Tomorrow the great deception that had strangled Rohan would begin to break. But for tonight, the Golden Hall still lay silent, cloaked in shadow, waiting for the first light of day. The dawn had not yet broken over Edoras, but the wind had changed. It swept down from the White Mountains, carrying with it something new, not the bitter chill of despair, but the first whispers of awakening. Gandalf, upon the back of Shadowfax, rode steadily through the winding path that led to Meduseld, his gray cloak flowing behind him like mist unfurling beneath the morning sky. The land was stirring, though few in Rohan could name what they felt. The whispers in the grass, the flickering of torches, and the restless stir of the great horses in their stables all spoke of a shift in the wind. Something unseen was beginning to break the enchantment that had bound the land in slow decay. And deep within the Golden Hall, behind the cold stone walls, where the king sat in silence, the spell that had held Théoden in chains was beginning to weaken. Inside the hall, the air was thick with the scent of burning wood, though little warmth reached the figure upon the throne. Théoden, once a king of great strength, sat motionless, his gaze vacant, his fingers curled weakly over the arms of his chair. His once golden hair had begun to gray, his face light not only with age, but with something far heavier, a poison of the mind, whispered day after day into his ears. At his side, ever present like a shadow stretching long in the dim firelight, stood Grima Wormtongue. His dark robes flowed like oil upon the stone floor, and though his face remained unreadable, his fingers twitched at his sides. He had felt the shift as well. The moment Gandalf had stepped upon the plains of Rohan, the spell had begun to falter. Wormtongue turned his head slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. Far away, in the depths of Isengard, Saruman was watching, but power built on whispers alone cannot stand against the storm. Elsewhere in the hall, Éowyn moved like a specter, her white robes flowing as she strode toward the great doors of Meduseld. She had not slept, nor had she spoken to anyone since she had seen the distant figure of Gandalf riding through the night. Though the day had not yet dawned, she knew he had come. As she reached the steps outside the hall, she looked eastward, and there, like the first breath of morning, she saw him. a figure upon a white horse, his presence like a beacon against the dim sky. Her breath caught in her throat. Though she had not known what she had been waiting for, her heart told her that this was it. The guards of Meduseld stiffened as the gray wizard approached. Their hands rested on their sword hilts, not out of loyalty to their king, but out of fear of what lay within the hall. Wormtongue's whispers had tainted even the bravest of men, and some had come to believe the lies he spread, that Gandalf was a deceiver, that his words carried danger, that his arrival would bring only ruin. But Gandalf did not slow. Shadowfax strode forward with the surety of a king's mount, undaunted by hesitation. "You cannot pass," one of the guards called, his voice uncertain despite the steel in his hand. Gandalf's piercing eyes met his, and for the first time in many months, the soldier felt clarity cut through the fog of doubt that had settled over him. "Is that your will?" Gandalf asked, his voice neither harsh nor soft, but heavy with meaning. The guard swallowed, his grip on his weapon loosening, for though he did not yet understand, something deep within told him that change was at hand. Without another word, the doors of Meduseld were opened. As Gandalf stepped forward, the flames in the hall wavered. The air itself seemed to shift, as though the walls had long waited for this moment. Théoden stirred slightly upon his throne, a shudder passing through his form, the first sign of life in many weeks. Wormtongue felt it too, though he fought to conceal his unease. He stepped forward quickly, his voice slithering into the air like a serpent coiling for an attack. "My lord," he said smoothly, his tone dripping with false concern, "this beggar has come unbidden, speaking riddles meant to confound you. We should send him away before he fills your mind with nonsense." But Gandalf did not acknowledge him. His eyes were fixed upon Théoden, upon the broken king before him, and then he spoke. "Théoden, son of Thengel." The voice was not loud, yet it echoed through the hall like a ripple across still water. At the sound of his own name, Théoden blinked, his fingers twitching where they rested upon the armrests. His lips parted as if he had meant to speak, yet no words came. Something stirred deep within him, something distant yet familiar. Wormtongue stiffened. "Enough," he hissed, stepping between Gandalf and the throne. But Gandalf raised his staff, and for the first time since he had entered the hall, power hummed in the air. The torches flared higher, the air crackled, as though an invisible veil was beginning to tear. Wormtongue stumbled back, his face twisting in fury, for he knew what was happening. The spell was breaking, and Théoden was awakening. Gandalf had not yet lifted the full weight of Saruman's sorcery, but the first glimpse of truth had broken through the veil. Théoden, for the first time in many weeks, had stirred. The whispering decay of Saruman's magic, which had bound him in slow submission, had been shaken. And though the battle for the king's spirit had not yet been won, the first crack had formed in the prison of his mind. As the hall stood silent, the firelight flickering, Gandalf stepped forward once more. "Come, Théoden King, look upon me." The king took a shuddering breath. The Fall of Isengard had begun. A hush fell over Meduseld, though the air was thick with an unseen tension. The firelight flickered against the stone walls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward King Théoden, as if even the darkness itself sought to release him from the grip of its unseen chains. For the first time in many long months, the king stirred, his clouded eyes blinking as if waking from a long and dreamless sleep. Gandalf stood before him, tall and unwavering, the gray folds of his cloak catching the dim light as he watched the king with steady, knowing eyes. His voice, neither loud nor forceful, had spoken the words that began to break the spell woven over the golden hall. "Théoden, son of Thingol, look upon me." The king's fingers twitched upon the armrests of his great chair, the weight of unseen years pressing upon his shoulders. He had heard that voice before, had known the name of Gandalf, yet for so long his mind had been clouded, his thoughts not entirely his own. And then, for the first time in what seemed an age, he spoke, his voice hoarse, fragile, as if it had not been used in a lifetime. What is this?" Grima Wormtongue stiffened where he stood, his dark robes pooling around his feet like oil seeping into the stone. He saw the king's fingers tighten ever so slightly, his back straightening, his breath growing deeper, steadier. This was not supposed to happen. His master's magic was strong, had taken root within Théoden's heart and mind like a creeping vine, strangling all that he had once been. And yet, with each word spoken by Gandalf, the vine was withering. Wormtongue's lips parted, his voice slithering into the space between them. "My lord," he said, stepping closer, forcing his voice into the same sickly sweetness he had always used. "You must not listen. He has come to deceive you, to fill your mind with empty promises." But Théoden did not turn to him this time. Instead, he stared at Gandalf, a flicker of something long buried awakening within him. Gandalf took another step forward, and the torches in the hall flared as if the very air resisted the shadows. "You have been held in chains, Théoden King, not of iron, but of whispers." The king's lips parted, but no words came. "You do not see it now, but you will," Gandalf continued, his voice soft yet firm. "Your eyes have been turned from the light, your mind filled with falsehoods. But tell me, Théoden." The wizard's gaze burned with something deeper, something ancient. "When did you last feel the wind upon your face?" Silence. A tremor passed through Théoden's hands, and for a moment it seemed as though the weight upon him had doubled. His body sagged, his breath coming quicker, and yet he was awake. The words struck something deep within him, a memory perhaps, of days long past, of riding across the plains beneath an open sky, the sound of hoofbeats like thunder, the wind pulling at his cloak, the sunlight warm upon his skin. It had been years. He looked down at his own hands, as though seeing them for the first time in an age. They were thinner than he remembered, weaker, the veins pressing against his skin like the brittle branches of an old tree. This was not how a king should look. This was not how he should look. Wormtongue felt it, the shift, the unraveling, his face twisted, his breath quickening. He had to act now, before it was too late. "My lord," he hissed, stepping forward, "do not let him poison your mind. Your enemies gather beyond our borders, and you would listen to the words of a wanderer? Gandalf's eyes flashed. Enough of your venom. And then he raised his staff. The very air trembled. The torches blazed. The shadows rippled as if something unseen had been torn from the very walls of Meduseld. A deep groan sounded through the hall, like the earth itself had sighed, and Théoden gasped. His body shook, and for a long moment he seemed caught between two worlds, one of sleep and shadow, and one of light and memory. And then, like a dam breaking beneath the weight of the river, he inhaled sharply, a great, shuddering breath, as if waking from the depths of a long and terrible dream. And when his eyes opened, they were clear. The hall fell silent. For the first time in months, Théoden rose from his throne. His movements were slow at first, uncertain, as though testing whether his limbs still remembered how to stand. But the weakness was fading, and when he finally stood tall, his shoulders squared, he was once again the King of Rohan. He turned his head slowly, his gaze settling on Wormtongue. "You," Théoden murmured, his voice stronger now, though not yet the full thunder of a king. "You have poisoned my mind." Wormtongue staggered back, for the first time feeling true fear. My lord," he stammered, "I have only ever—" "Enough," Théoden interrupted, his voice quiet but unyielding. He straightened, the years seeming to fall from him as if they had never been. And then, for the first time in what seemed an eternity, he smiled. A small thing, a mere flicker of expression, but to those who saw it, it was the first light of dawn after a long and terrible night. Outside the hall, the winds of Rohan stirred. The great banners that hung from the golden roof of Meduseld, once limp and motionless, began to ripple once more. And in the stables, the great horses of the mark lifted their heads, whinnying softly, as though sensing that their king had finally returned. The darkness had not yet been fully driven from Rohan, but the first battle had been won. The time had come to ride again. The morning sun bathed the plains of Rohan in gold, its light breaking through the last of the shadows that had long lingered over Meduseld. The air was crisp, fresh, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the distant echo of hooves upon the wind. At the steps of the Golden Hall, King Théoden, now free from Saruman's spell, stood tall, his once clouded eyes now sharp with newfound purpose. The years of weariness had fallen from him, and though age still touched his features, his strength had returned. Beside him, Gandalf the White watched silently, his staff planted firmly against the stone floor, his eyes ever seeing. The battle for Théoden's mind had been won, but a greater war loomed ahead. Isengard still stood, and Saruman's armies gathered in the dark places of the world, preparing to sweep across Rohan like a flood. The king turned his gaze toward the stables, where the Riders of Rohan were making ready. A host would ride this day, not for war, but for alliance, to seek aid where it could yet be found. And so, under the rising sun, the king of the mark rode forth once more. The company was small, but each rider was chosen with purpose. Théoden led, clad in armor that gleamed in the morning light, his golden cloak billowing behind him. Éomer, his nephew, rode at his side, his spear resting across his saddle. Gandalf, ever watchful, sat astride Shadowfax, his presence alone a beacon of hope. And behind them, a handful of Riders of Rohan, their helms catching the sun, their swords sheathed but ready. Their destination was Gondor, but the road was long and dangers lay ahead. By midday, they had passed beyond the rolling hills of Edoras and reached the great woods of the Wold, where the trees grew thick and the air carried the whisper of unseen voices. As they rode beneath the towering oaks, the horses grew restless, their ears flicking forward, their steps lighter. Something unseen stirred in the shadows. Gandalf, sensing it first, raised a hand, and the company slowed. "Riders of the Mark," came a voice from the trees, low yet strong, ancient yet commanding. The riders turned their heads sharply, hands drifting to their weapons, but Gandalf merely smiled. From the dappled shade of the great trees, a figure stepped forward, clad in robes of deep green, his silver hair flowing past his shoulders like river mist. An elf, Théoden's brow furrowed, for the elves had long since withdrawn from the affairs of men, yet this one stood before him with purpose. "Haldir of Lothlorien," Gandalf greeted, inclining his head. The elf nodded in return, his gray eyes unreadable. "The Lady of the Golden Wood has seen the shifting of the tides. She sends word that Lothlorien watches." A murmur rippled through the riders, for few in Rohan had ever stood before one of Galadriel's kin. Gandalf's gaze grew knowing. "And what does the lady see?" Haldir's eyes flicked toward Théoden, then beyond him, as if peering into the very bones of the land. "She sees a fire rising in the east, and a storm that gathers at your doorstep. The hour is later than you know, King of the Mark." Théoden's jaw tightened, though he did not waver. "We do not seek war, but we shall not flee from it either." Haldir studied him for a moment, then reached into the folds of his cloak. From within, he withdrew a silver-bound message, sealed with the sigil of Lothlorien. "Then take this to Gondor," he said, handing it to Gandalf. "Let the White City know that they do not stand alone." The wizard accepted the letter with a solemn nod. "Your aid is not forgotten, nor will it be unheeded." With a final glance toward Théoden, Haldir gave a slight bow, then turned and vanished into the trees. The riders sat in silence for a moment longer before Théoden finally urged his horse forward. "Let us ride," he said. "Time is short." By nightfall, the company had left the green hills of Rohan behind, entering the lands where the air grew still and the land seemed older, untouched by the hands of men. The ground beneath them grew soft, the scent of damp earth thick upon the wind. They had reached the edges of the dead marshes. Though their path did not lead directly through the cursed land, its presence was a shadow upon the road, an ever-present reminder of ancient battles and unburied dead. Even the horses, though mighty, grew uneasy, their hooves sinking slightly into the damp soil. Gandalf rode ahead, his gaze distant. He had passed through these lands before, long ago, and knew well the whispers of the lost. "Do not look upon the water," he warned, his voice barely out of a murmur, and so they rode in silence, the mist curling around them like unseen fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a faint light flickered, though whether it was the lantern of a wandering soul or something else entirely, none could say. But even as they pressed forward, the weight of war hung ever closer, drawing them onward to the great battle yet to come. As dawn approached once more, the riders finally saw the first glimpse of Gondor's distant peaks. The White City was still far, but the journey was nearing its final leg. Yet none among them knew what awaited them there. Would they find allies or only ruins? Would the banners of Rohan ride to war, or would the forces of darkness consume them before the horn of Helm's Deep could even sound? The journey was not yet done, but hope rode with them, and in the end, that would make all the difference. Night had fallen over the lands of Gondor, stretching a dark velvet sky speckled with ancient stars above the weary travelers. The Riders of Rohan, now deep within the southern lands, had made camp at the edge of the great river Anduin, where the waters flowed slow and deep beneath the silver moonlight. The fires burned low, their golden embers dancing lazily in the cool night air. Beyond the horizon, the dark clouds of war gathered, but for this one evening, the company found solace beneath the stars, wrapped in quiet conversation and the hush of the great world turning. Gandalf, ever watchful, sat apart from the others, his sharp eyes tracing the constellations, as if seeking some hidden wisdom in the sky. Beside him, Théoden King, though burdened by the weight of war, had found a rare moment of stillness, his hands resting over his sword as he gazed out across the rippling waters of the Anduin. But it was not only warriors who had gathered beneath the heavens this night. An old voice stirred the silence. "You carry much upon your shoulders, my lord," said Gamling, the king's trusted captain, his face lined with the years of many battles. "But the stars above us are the same that watched over Rohan when it was first founded. They have seen our people rise and fall, and still they remain." Théoden nodded slowly, his voice low. "They remind me that our story is but one thread in a greater tapestry." "That is the way of the world," Gandalf murmured, exhaling softly as his pipe sent a thin trail of smoke curling into the night. "Even in the darkest of days, the echoes of the past can guide us forward." A silence settled then, not an empty silence, but one pregnant with unspoken words, with the weight of history resting upon their shoulders. And then, softly at first, Gamling spoke again, weaving a tale as the flames flickered and the wind carried his words across the camp. "Long before our time," Gamling said, his voice deep and steady, "when the Mark was still young, there was a king named Helm Hammerhand." The Rohirrim who sat near leaned forward, their eyes reflecting the fire's glow, for all knew the name, but few had heard the story told in the old way, in the manner of their ancestors. He was a mighty man, taller than any other, and strong as the oxen that roam the plains. He ruled in times of war, for the men of Dunland had long hated Rohan, and their chieftains sought to claim the lands of the horse lords as their own. The wind stirred softly through the trees, rustling the tall grass, as if the land itself listened to the tale. Their leader, Freka, was a man of great ambition, and he sought to wed his son to the daughter of Helm, hoping to unite the bloodlines and take Rohan without war. But Helm was no fool. He saw the poison in Freka's words and knew that Dunland would never bow before the mark. The fire crackled as Gamling's voice dropped lower. So, when Freka insulted the king before his own council, Helm struck him down with his bare hands. A murmur rippled through the men. Though many had heard the story, it still carried weight, for Helm Hammerhand had been unlike any king before or after him. With Freka dead, his people rose in rebellion, and war fell upon Rohan. But worse still, winter came, bitter and cruel, the likes of which had not been seen in an age. The land froze, the rivers turned to ice, and the snow buried the plains beneath a silent, merciless white. Gamling's gaze flickered toward Théoden. It was in that long winter that Helm and his people were driven back to the deep valley of Aglarond, where they took shelter in the fortress that would one day bear his name, Helm's Deep. The men around the fire shifted, for the memory of their recent battle within that same fortress was still fresh in their minds. But food was scarce, and hope was thinner still. The Dunlendings surrounded them, waiting for the cold to do what their swords could not. The people despaired, but Helm, he did not yield. Gamling's voice toned to a near whisper. They say he would leave the fortress alone, clad in nothing but white, blending into the endless snows, and he would slay his enemies with his bare hands, leaving their frozen bodies as warnings in the drifts. And so the Dunlendings came to fear him, believing him no longer a man, but a wraith of winter, a ghost of vengeance. Even when the horn of Helm's Deep sounded in the night, they fled, thinking his spirit would come for them. The silence stretched long after his words faded, the men staring into the flames, lost in the memory of their forefathers. Though the war ended, Helm never saw the spring. Gamling finished softly. They found him frozen upon the walls, standing tall even in death, his hands still gripping the hilt of his sword. A gust of wind sighed through the camp, and for a long moment none spoke. At last, Théoden let out a breath. "We have always endured," he murmured, "even in the coldest winters." "Aye," Gamling nodded, "and we always shall." The fire crackled softly, and then, from where he sat, Gandalf finally spoke. "Helm Hammerhand's tale is one of strength," he said, "but it is also a tale of loneliness. He was feared by his enemies, but also by his own people, and so when he died, he left behind not a kingdom at peace, but one that trembled at his memory." Théoden studied him. "Do you think him too harsh?" Gandalf shook his head. "I think that he was a man of his time, but I tell you this, Théoden King, history remembers not only those who fight, but those who lead with wisdom. Strength may win battles, but it is wisdom that keeps the land at peace." The king's expression did not waver, but in the flickering firelight, something in his gaze shifted, softened. He turned his head, looking toward Éomer, who sat quietly among his men, listening. He looked toward Éowyn, who stood at the edge of the camp, her gaze turned toward the distant stars. And he thought of what would come after the war, not only the battle ahead. "We ride for Gondor at dawn," he said at last. Let us rest while the stars still shine." Gandalf nodded, his sharp eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Yes," he murmured, "let us rest while we may." And above them, the stars burned on, eternal and unchanging, bearing witness to yet another night in the great and unfolding tale of Middle-earth. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the lands of Gondor. The air was crisp, carrying with it the distant scent of the Anduin, the great river that wound through the heart of the realm. In the growing light, the banners of Rohan fluttered in the wind, the white horse upon a green field standing tall against the dark sky of the east. The company had traveled far, across the rolling pleasant plains of Rohan, through the haunted whispers of the dead marshes, past the watchful gaze of the White Mountains. Now, standing upon the last rise before the great city of Minas Tirith, King Théoden and his riders beheld the sight of Gondor in peril. Before them, Minas Tirith stood, proud yet battered. Its white walls gleamed in the morning light, but the fires of war burned beneath its ramparts. Dark banners of Mordor rippled in the wind, and from the fields below, the vast armies of Sauron had gathered, their siege weapons poised to strike. The city's great gates were shattered, its defenders fighting desperately upon the walls. The fate of Gondor hung in the balance. For a long moment, Théoden said nothing, only watched as the smoke curled into the sky, as the sounds of battle echoed across the plain. Then, softly at first, he exhaled. "We have come at last," he murmured. At his side, Éomer's grip tightened upon his spear, "and none too soon," he said grimly. Gandalf, ever watchful, studied the battlefield below, his face unreadable. He had foreseen much, but even he could not yet tell if this day would end in victory or ruin. "Hope is not yet lost," the wizard murmured, "but it will take all the strength of Rohan to turn the tide." Théoden nodded slowly. "Then we shall give Gondor all that we have." The King of the Mark turned, his gaze sweeping over his riders. They were weary, but unbroken. The road had been long, the battle not yet begun, and yet their resolve did not falter. Raising his sword high, he called out, "Riders of Rohan, sons of the Mark, the day has come." His voice rang clear over the plains, a summons to battle, a call to glory. From the ranks of the Rohirrim, a great horn sounded, deep and powerful, its echoes rolling like thunder over the fields of Pelennor. The Rohirrim were here. And then they rode. With a great cry, the horse lords of Rohan thundered down the slope, their lances gleaming in the sun, their banners streaming behind them. The orcs of Mordor turned in terror, their ranks shifting as the sound of 1,000 hooves bore down upon them. Gandalf rode ahead, his staff blazing with white fire, cutting through the shadows. Théoden led at his side, his sword flashing, his voice ringing with the fury of a king reborn. "Forth, Eorlingus!" The crash of steel upon steel shook the earth as Rohan clashed with the forces of Mordor, their charge breaking through the enemy lines like a wave of fire. For a moment, the dark tide seemed to falter, the riders driving deep into the heart of the enemy ranks, their spears piercing through the darkness. But even as victory seemed within reach, a new shadow fell across the battlefield. From the Anduin, great black ships had arrived, their dark sails billowing in the wind. Upon their decks stood more of Sauron's forces, prepared to spill forth and overwhelm the defenders of Gondor. A murmur of dread rippled through the ranks of the Rohirrim, and for the first time Théoden's heart wavered. Had they come all this way, fought so hard, only to be swept away in the end? But before despair could take root, a new banner unfurled upon the wind. Not the black banners of the enemy, but a white tree upon a field of black and silver. And at the head of the ships, a king stood once more. It was Aragorn, Isildur's heir, come at last in Gondor's hour of need. Behind him stood Legolas and Gimli, and beside them the dead men of Dunharrow, their spectral forms shimmering like mist in the morning sun. With a cry, the king of Gondor led his forces ashore, and the battlefield erupted once more in chaos. Théoden's heart surged with renewed strength. The battle was not lost, not yet. But fate had one last hand to play. As the battle raged, a great shadow loomed above the field. From the depths of the sky, upon vast black wings, the Witch King of Angmar descended. His terrible voice echoed over the plains, his fell beast shrieking, striking terror into the hearts of all who heard it. Théoden's horse reared, struck by the fearsome presence, and the king was thrown from his saddle. For a moment, time seemed to slow. He lay upon the field, his breath shallow, the weight of his years and his wounds settling upon him. Around him, the battle raged on, but he knew this was his final hour, and yet, even in his dying breath, he did not fear. He had ridden to battle as a king, and he would die as one, but he would not die alone. For beside him, standing tall in the face of the darkness, Éowyn stood, unyielding. "Begone, foul Dwemer Lake," she cried, her voice fierce and unshaken. And the Witch King, for all his power, did not know what awaited him. For prophecy had spoken, no man could kill him. But Éowyn was no man. By the time the sun set, the field of Pelennor lay silent. The armies of Mordor were broken, scattered by the combined might of Rohan and Gondor. The White City still stood, her walls bloodied but unbowed. Théoden, son of Thengel, king of Rohan, had fallen, but Rohan had not. His people would ride again, and in the heart of Gondor, the banners of the White Tree flew high, for the king had returned, and with him the final stand against Sauron's darkness. Gandalf stood upon the walls of Minas Tirith, looking out over the land, his mind heavy with the weight of all that had come to pass. The war was not yet won, but for the first time in an age, there was hope. The past had been remembered, the legacy of kings restored, and the battle for Middle-earth would rage on until the very end. The stars had begun their slow descent toward the western horizon, fading gently into the light of a new dawn. From the high walls of Minas Tirith, Gandalf stood in silence, watching as the first golden hues of morning stretched across the battle-worn fields of Pelennor. The night had been long, and the cost had been great, but the White City still stood. The banners of Gondor, torn and tattered, fluttered in the morning breeze, catching the sunlight like weary sentinels of a hard-won victory. Beyond the ruins of battle, the Anduin flowed ever onward, its waters glistening as though the very river carried whispers of the past, carrying away the echoes of war and sorrow. Gandalf sighed, his breath soft against the chill morning air. Though the armies of Mordor had been driven back, though Théoden's sacrifice had not been in vain, the war was not yet over, and yet, for the first time in many long years, there was hope. Below the great citadel, in the streets of Minas Tirith, the people had begun to stir, not with fear, as they had in the shadow of war, but with quiet determination. Children peeked cautiously from behind stone pillars, their wide eyes reflecting both wonder and grief. Mothers gathered their sons and daughters, brushing away the dust of battle, whispering promises of better days to come. The warriors of Gondor moved through the streets, some bearing the wounded, others carrying the fallen, with quiet reverence, their faces lined with sorrow, but also pride. In the courtyard of the White Tree, Éomer stood in silent mourning beside his sister, Éowyn, who had faced down the terror of the Witch King and lived. She was pale but unbowed, her hand resting upon her brother's arm, the wind gently pulling at the strands of her golden hair. Her gaze was distant, lost in thought, as if she still stood upon the battlefield, hearing the echo of her own voice as she defied the dark. But her heart did not linger in shadow. She had looked into the face of fear and did not turn away. A short distance away, the Riders of Rohan stood gathered in solemn formation. Their heads were bowed, their hands resting upon their sword hilts, as the body of King Théoden was prepared for its journey home. He would not be laid to rest in Minas Tirith, nor upon the field where he fell. His heart belonged to Rohan, to the green hills of Edoras, where the kings of old slept in the golden halls of their fathers. As the sun climbed higher, a hush fell over the assembled warriors. Gandalf stepped forward, his white robes moving lightly in the wind. He lifted his staff, and his voice, though quiet, carried over them all. "Do not weep for him, Riders of Rohan," he said, "for though he has fallen, he did not fall in vain. A king of great honor, a warrior of true courage, his name shall be remembered in the songs of your people until the end of days." The men of Rohan did not speak, but their silence was full of unspoken oaths, of loyalty unbroken even in death. Théoden had ridden into battle one last time, and though he would not see the dawn, his kingdom would, and what greater victory could there be? From the steps of the citadel, Aragorn watched. The man who had walked as a ranger, a wanderer in the wild, now stood upon the threshold of his greatest destiny. He had arrived not as a king crowned, but as a king proven. The people of Gondor had seen him ride into battle, had seen him stand against the darkness, and now they looked to him with new eyes. But Aragorn knew that a crown was more than metal and gold. To rule was to bear the weight of a people's hope, to carry the burden of their past and the shaping of their future, and Gondor was not yet whole. Mordor still waited, its dark lord unbroken, and there would be no peace until the shadow was cast down forever. Gandalf turned toward him, his sharp eyes filled with understanding. You cannot linger here, Aragorn. The path leads onward. Aragorn nodded slowly. I know, but his gaze swept once more over the city of his ancestors, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to wonder. What would Minas Tirith look like after the war was won? Would its streets once more ring with laughter rather than the cries of battle? Would its people sing songs of joy rather than dirges for the fallen? The day would come. He had to believe it, and when that day came, he would be ready. As the sun rose higher, the company began their farewells. The Riders of Rohan prepared to bear their king home, while Gandalf, Aragorn, and their allies turned their sights toward the final battle yet to come. There was no certainty in what lay ahead, but there was one truth they all carried in their hearts. They had come this far together, and whatever fate awaited them, they would face it as one. Gandalf turned, his white cloak billowing softly as he walked toward Shadowfax, his steady hand brushing along the stallion's mane. He paused for only a moment, lifting his gaze to the sky, where the sun shone, bright and golden, banishing the last remnants of night. And with that, the white wizard rode forth once more into the unknown, into the final battle that would decide the fate of Middle-earth. Now, my sleepy fellows, the tale draws to a close. The winds of war still stir, the road ahead uncertain, but for now, let us rest in the knowledge that courage still burns bright, even in the darkest of times. Let the echo of the Rohirrim's charge carry you into dreams, where the golden fields of Rohan stretch endlessly before you, where the white tree of Gondor stands tall against the sky. And as you drift into slumber, know that the story of Middle-earth continues on, just as all great stories do. For though kings may fall and battles may rage, the light of the world is never truly lost. Good night, my dear listener. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the whisper of ancient songs, the soft glow of elven lanterns, and the quiet footsteps of heroes walking paths long forgotten. Until we meet again.